Hey, what's up, everybody? It's your favorite twin, and we are back again for another read aloud of Just Mercy. So, I have my drink already. I'm having a Celsius orange, very crisp and refreshing, like a bubbly, but it's a little bit more of a kick to it. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started with today's read aloud. I grew up in a poor rural settlement on the eastern shore of the Delmarva Peninsula in Delaware, where the racial history of this country casts a long shadow. Confederate flags, symbols of white supremacy and slavery, were proudly displayed throughout the region. African Americans lived in racially segregated ghettos isolated by railroad tracks within small towns or in colored sections in the country. Some people lived in tiny shacks. Families without indoor plumbing had to use outhouses. We shared our outdoor play space with chickens and pigs. The black people around me were strong and determined, but marginalized and excluded. My father left the area as a teenager because there was no local high school for black children. He returned with my mother and found work in a food factory. On weekends, he did domestic work at beach cottages and rentals. My mother worked at an Air Force base. My relatives worked hard all the time, but never seemed to prosper. My grandmother was the daughter of people who were enslaved in Caroline County, Virginia. She was born in the 1880s, her parents in the 1840s. Her father talked to her all the time about growing up in slavery. He had learned to read and write, but kept it a secret until emancipation, that is, when he was freed. The legacy of slavery shaped my grandmother. It shaped the way she raised her 9 children. It influenced the way she talked to me, the way she constantly told me, keep close. All right, we're going to go ahead and answer that first question. How would you describe Brian's family history? This is a pretty broad question, meaning that there's a lot of answers that could work here. So here's some important details. He's saying, I grew up in a poor rural settlement on the eastern shore of the Delmarva Peninsula in Delaware, and my relatives worked hard all the time but never seemed to prosper. And then he goes on to mention how his grandmother was the daughter of enslaved people. If you'd like a sentence starter, you can use I would describe his family history as blank. All right, let's go ahead and move on. When I visited her, she would hug me so tightly that I could barely breathe, but it made me happy to be wrapped in her formidable arms. You can't understand most of the important things from a distance, Brian. You have to get close, she told me often. The distance I experienced in my first year of law school made me feel lost. Closeness to the condemned, to people unfairly judged, that was what guided me back to something that felt like home. This book is about how quickly we condemn people in this country. It is about the dramatic increase in the number of people incarcerated in America, a phenomenon known as mass incarceration. It is about extreme punishment, the harsh, excessive sentences we give to the condemned, and the sinister treatment they face once in prison. It is about how we create injustice by allowing our fear, anger, and distance to guide the way we treat those who are more vulnerable. It's also about a dramatic period in our recent history that marked the lives of millions of Americans of all races, ages, and genders, and the country as a whole. All right, let's go ahead and answer that second question. What does Brian claim this book is mostly about? So, we have talked about central idea. This is basically what he says is the central idea of the book. You'll find information about this in this paragraph right here. Keep in mind a few important details. It's about the dramatic increase in the number of people incarcerated in America, the harsh, excessive sentences we give to the condemned, and the sinister treatment they face once in prison. So, those are a couple of important details that might help you answer this question. If you'd like a sentence starter, you can use Brian claims this book is mostly about blank. All right, let's go ahead and continue. When I first visited death row in December 1983, America was going through a radical transformation. We were imprisoning more people than any other country. Today, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. In the early 1970s, the prison population was 300,000 people. Currently, it's 2.3 million people. Nearly 6 million people are on probation, meaning they've been released from prison sentence but are still supervised, or on parole, meaning they've been released from their prison sentence on good behavior. 1 in every 15 people born in the United States in 2001 is expected to go to jail or prison. 1 in every 3 black male babies born in this century is expected to be incarcerated. To be clear, these numbers reflect who is being convicted and incarcerated, not who is necessarily committing the crimes. We have shot, hanged, gassed, electrocuted, and lethally injected hundreds of people in the name of the law. Thousands more await their execution in the section of prisons known as death row. We sent 250,000 kids, some under the age of 12, to adult jails and prisons. For years, we've been the only country in the world that condemns children to life imprisonment without parole. We've created laws that make nonviolent offenses, like writing a bad check or committing a petty theft, result in life imprisonment. We have locked away people with substance abuse problems, with more than 500,000 people in state or federal prisons for drug offenses. We've given up on rehabilitation, education, and services for the imprisoned because providing assistance to the incarcerated is apparently too kind and compassionate. We've institutionalized policies that reduce people to their worst acts and permanently label them criminal, murderer, rapist, thief, drug dealer, sex offender, felon, identities they cannot change regardless of the circumstances of their crimes or any improvements they might try making in their lives. Mass incarceration's effect on the world outside of prisons have been equally profound. We ban poor people and their children from receiving food stamps and public housing if they have prior drug convictions, often leaving them homeless and unemployable. Some states strip people with criminal convictions of the right to vote. As a result, in several southern states, disenfranchisement among African American men has reached levels unseen since before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which legally prohibited racial discrimination in voting. We also make terrible mistakes. Thousands of innocent people suffer in prison. Scores have been exonerated, cleared of guilt, after being sentenced to death and nearly executed. Hundreds of prisoners who are not on death row have been released after being proved innocent through DNA testing. Presumptions of guilt based on poverty and racial bias have created a system that is defined by error. Finally, we spend lots of money on prisons, nearly $80 billion every year. To cover the cost, state governments have taken away funds from public services, education, health, and welfare. In fact, private prison builders and state service companies have paid millions of dollars to state and local governments, trying to convince them to create new crimes, impose harsher sentences, and keep more people locked up so that they can increase profits. The privatization of mass incarceration is a moneymaker for a few and a costly nightmare for the rest of us, and it has ruined efforts to improve public safety, reduce the costs of mass incarceration, and most significantly, promote rehabilitation of the incarcerated. All right, let's go ahead and answer the next question. What problems does Brian mention about our criminal justice system? This is another broad question, and he does mention a lot. But here's a few that you could focus on. Some states strip people with criminal convictions of the right to vote, meaning that in some states, if you commit a certain type of crime, you cannot vote. We have thousands of innocent people suffer in prison, and then scores have been exonerated. So that means that they were found out not to have been guilty. And then we have the amount of money that we spend on prisons. Finally, we spend lots of money on prisons, nearly $80 billion every year. And that takes away from things like education, healthcare, welfare, things like that. If you need a sentence starter, you can use Brian mentions blank. All right, let's go ahead and finish the read aloud and answer the last question. After graduating from law school, I returned to the Deep South to represent the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. In the last 30 years, I've gotten close to people who have been wrongly convicted and sent to death row, people like Walter McMillian. In this book, you will learn the story of Walter's case, which shows how our legal system convicts and condemns people irresponsibly with disturbing and traumatic results. But Walter's case also taught me something else. There is light within this darkness. Walter's story is one of many that I tell in these chapters. I've represented abused and neglected children who were prosecuted as adults and suffered more abuse and mistreatment after being placed in adult facilities. I've represented women whose numbers in prison have increased 640% in the last 30 years and seen how our hysteria about drug addiction and our hostility to the poor have made us quick to criminalize them. I've represented mentally disabled people whose illnesses have landed them in prison for decades. I've gotten close to victims of violent crime and their families and witnessed how mass imprisonment has even made prison staff more violent and angry and less just and merciful. I've also represented people who have committed terrible crimes, but nonetheless strive to recover and to find redemption. I've discovered deep in the hearts of many condemned and incarcerated people seeds of hope and humanity that come to astonishing life when nurtured by very simple acts of care and respect. My work has taught me a vital lesson. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I am persuaded that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. Finally, I've come to believe that the true measure of our commitment to justice, fairness, and equality cannot be measured by how we treat the rich, the respected, and the privileged among us. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. We are all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. An absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, an entire nation. Fear and anger can make us cruel and abusive. We all suffer from the absence of mercy, and we harm ourselves as much as we victimize others. The closer we get to mass incarceration and extreme levels of punishment, the more I believe it's necessary to recognize that we all need mercy. We all need justice, and perhaps we all need some measure of unmerited grace. All right, let's go ahead and answer that last question. What does Brian say is the true measure of our character? You'll find the answer that you're looking for in the last part of this paragraph. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. If you need a sentence starter, you can use he says the true measure of our character is blank. All right, everybody, that is it for today's read aloud. And we have officially finished the introduction of Just Mercy. And we are going to get into the main part of the book. So I'm excited for that. Hope you are too. And I will see you next time. Take care.